Lindsey Hilsum, our international editor. Today we're going to talk about Ukraine's spring offensive. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you that I think it's a summer offensive, and I think that they've already started shaping the battlefield. I think that the Ukrainians have started attacking command and control, logistics centers, and so on. But I think it's very hard to know exactly where they are going to push and how. Is it going to be all those tanks that the West have provided, or are we going to see something spectacular, like the Storm Shadow missiles provided by the British, going straight into the ships of the Black Sea Fleet? We just don't know.
Lindsey, it's been a while since we discussed the war in Ukraine. And I think the last time we spoke, it was all about the stalemate. You'd been to the trenches in the east. But we've been waiting for a number of months, really, for this spring offensive from Ukraine. I mean, what exactly is the spring offensive? And, well, has it even started yet?
Well, I think the spring offensive is a summer offensive.
Okay.
But one of the things was they were waiting for the weather to dry out because there was a lot of mud. And I was speaking to somebody just half an hour ago who'd just come back from the front line and who told me, yeah, it's dry as a bone there now. So that has changed. But they were waiting for a whole number of things to fall into place, so Western weaponry to arrive, troops to be trained, new units to form, all of those kind of things. But, you know, I suppose what I should say at the beginning of this podcast is I'm not General Hilsum. Yeah, I'm not even Major Hilsum.
You're Poet Hilsum.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not a poet. I'm just a journalist. I like poetry. So, you know, I can't give you all of the sort of military rationale, but from looking at what's going on, you can begin to see that things are moving, and that they're doing what the military call shaping operations, which means that the Ukrainians are beginning to attack command and control centers. They're, you know, drone attacks on oil depots and on logistics places, all of those kinds of things. They're trying to probe the Russians' weak points on that 1,000-kilometer long front line. So that gives you an idea that they're beginning to work up towards this offensive.
Why has it always been a thing we've been waiting for or expecting? Where did this idea of the spring offensive come from?
Because fighting doesn't shut down, but it slows down during the winter because of the weather, because of the snow and the ice, and you know, it becomes very, very difficult to operate. And what has happened in Ukraine is that the fighting all got concentrated on this one place, Bakhmut, and they're still fighting there. But the idea through the winter from the Ukrainian point of view was to tie up the Russians in Bakhmut as much as possible. But the Russians, of course, have also used the time because they know that the Ukrainians have to do a counteroffensive because the Russians have taken so much territory. The Russians control 18% of Ukraine at the moment. That's in the east and in Crimea. And so what they've been doing in this time is shoring up their defenses. So there are now, in a lot of that front line, there are 4 lines of defenses. You've got ditches so that tanks can't go across them. You've got razor wire. You've got what they call dragon's teeth, which are these sort of concrete pyramids in a row. And you've got minefields. So imagine what that's going to be like for the Ukrainian forces trying to push. And while we have been, you know, we being the West have been like, you know, come on, when are you going to start your spring offensive? From the Ukrainian point of view, on the one hand, they're trying to balance out the need to get all their ducks in a row, to get to be at the maximum strength and efficiency. But also every day that's gone by they're doing that has enabled the Russians to prepare those defenses better.
Does the fact that we've seen some Ukrainian gains in Bakhmut mean that potentially that's where some of the spring offensive has potentially begun?
I mean, that's what Prigozhin, our famous and favourite mercenary leader, the guy who founded the Wagner Group, who have, I don't know, 50,000 troops fighting around Bakhmut. That's what he says. He says it's all up here. But I think that he's saying that partly because he's trying to always get more ammunition out of the Russian military for his forces. And so he's like, it's happening here, we need the ammunition. But somebody I was talking to was just there, said that, interestingly, that whereas the Ukrainians had been pushed back, in the last few days, week, they've pushed forwards again, and the Russian flanks on either side have started to collapse. And so that there's a road which they call the Road of Life, which is the road from Bakhmut sort of into Ukraine down to Kramatorsk, that the Russians apparently no longer have fire control over that, meaning that if you drive along there, you're no longer dicing with death because the Russians can't always shoot everything that goes along there. And there's a lot of Ukrainian armour, a lot of it spanking new, in that area. But I think that what most military analysts seem to think is that the area which the Ukrainians are most interested in is much further south, down towards Crimea, because what they really want to do is cut the line which the Russians have from Crimea into Ukraine and from the Donetsk. I mean, it's hard to do a podcast without a map, isn't it? So you sort of think of an arc that goes down in the southeast corner, because that's where the Russians get all their resupply through the east and the south, and so that's what the Ukrainians want to cut off, and so that's where the Russians have put their most ferocious defences, I'm told.
I guess when it comes to the spring offensive, we're not going to get a sort of press release saying it's begun. But I mean, I guess a clue that perhaps it hasn't begun is that President Zelenskyy has been touring Europe, which seems to indicate that he's trying to sort of close more deals to try and ensure that the Ukrainians are in the best position for the offensive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're going to, wake up one day and, oh my God, it's begun. I don't think it's going to be quite like that. And when you think of the late summer counteroffensive last year, the point of that was the element of surprise. So what the Ukrainians did was that they made a big song and dance about what they were doing down in the southeast. And meanwhile, stealthily, they pushed across in the northeast and they took a lot of villages there. And the Russians had abandoned their positions there to concentrate down in the southeast. Well, I don't think the Russians, are going to be caught out twice like that. But also, in as much as they can have any element of surprise, they're not going to want to publicise what they're doing exactly as they do it.
One assumes it won't be as sort of obvious as, well, at the beginning of the war when it was like, oh, there's the Russians, 40-odd tanks north of Kyiv in one line. It's going to be a bit more complicated and a bit more...
Well, it's going to be more complicated because also you think about what you've got militarily. So I think that when we think of an offensive, we still tend to think of, I don't know, we think of Vietnam or so you think of, great, huge squadrons of helicopters coming over and dropping napalm on the jungle. Or you think of World War I and, all of the poor bloody infantry going across the Somme or whatever. I don't think it's going to be quite like that because although obviously you're going to have armoured units and you're going to have tanks and so on, if you think about the weaponry that the British have just provided to Ukraine.
Let's quickly recap President Zelenskyy's trip across Europe. He visited Berlin, Rome and Paris, with the German Chancellor promising additional military aid of more than $3 billion, and French President Emmanuel Macron saying his country would help Ukraine for as long as it takes. Zelenskyy then met Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and Britain pledged hundreds of long-range attack drones and missiles for Ukraine. The two leaders hugged as Sunak said Ukraine's bravery in the face of Russia's aggression was an inspiration to us all. Zelenskyy's trip took place after he told the BBC in an interview that Ukraine needed more time for its counteroffensive, and he's still pushing to be supplied with fighter jets. Rishi Sunak and Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, did agree this week to start an international coalition to help secure F-16 fighter jets for Ukraine. But the United States would need to approve any jets being sent to Kyiv, and Washington still maintains that Ukraine does not need the F-16 fighter jets.
It's the long-range cruise missiles and, interestingly, long-range drones as well. So you think, well, what do they want to do with that? Now, they've said that they're not going to use those weapons for firing into Russia proper. But obviously they are going to use them for firing into the parts of Ukraine that Russia controls. And so then I was thinking about it this morning and I was thinking, well, what would I do? And I think, well, there are huge barrages of cruise missiles coming into Kyiv and other cities every night at the moment. Where are they fired from? They're fired from the Black Sea Fleet. Mm-hmm. They're fired from these ships off Sevastopol in Crimea. Well, now the Ukrainians have got the capacity to try and take out ships in the Black Sea Fleet. So if they did something like that, that would have massive symbolic importance, because the Black Sea Fleet it's a real symbol of Russian military naval power. It has huge historical significance. And also Crimea is a huge symbolic thing for both sides.
We don't know what this will look like, but do we get a sense of what Ukraine might want from this? One of the things I think is interesting about what you were talking about in terms of what the British are now offering, you do get a sense from the West that, if they're offering long-range missiles, is that because they now have full faith that Ukraine won't antagonize Russia and fire into their land? Or is it because they're saying, we think these guys can win now?
Look, what does winning mean? And this is the really complicated thing. So you look at what President Zelenskyy says. President Zelenskyy says the Russians have to get out of every inch of our territory. I don't think that...
To before 2014?
Yes, to before 2014.
So including Crimea?
Yeah, including Crimea. What he says, and this is the official Ukrainian line, which is that you look at the borders of Ukraine in 1991 at independence, when it split from the Soviet Union, and that is where the line is. And internationally, that's right. That is the internationally recognized border. Now, how realistic is that? I think that most Western military analysts and, people in defense intelligence and so on do not expect this offensive over the next few months to be able to achieve that. What they, I think, are hoping that the Ukrainians will manage to do is push the Russians back to a point where the Ukrainians are in a greater position of strength from which to negotiate. Mm-hmm. But I also think that there's another complicated thing, which is, if we think of the territory that Ukraine would retake, what do we know about that territory? A lot of it has been in Russian hands since 2014. The people who remain there are on the whole elderly and on the whole quite pro-Russian, right? They are not necessarily going to see the Ukrainians as liberators. I'm sure they want peace. But, the fact that, you push the Russians out doesn't mean you get peace, because what happens when you push the Russians out is that the Russians then start attacking that town with artillery. That's what we saw in Kherson. In Kherson, which was occupied by the Russians for a long time, the people had a miserable time being occupied by the Russians, but they weren't being attacked. Now they're attacked every day. And so I think it is quite complicated what victory is, because I don't think that all of the population would welcome the Ukrainians as liberators. And rebuilding that territory would be unbelievably expensive. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars.
We're now talking about the spring offensive, and everyone seems to be talking about it. Is it also that we might slightly overemphasize the offensive and what we expect from it?
I think that there is, in a sense, too much expectation put on this one offensive. And I think President Zelenskyy is very aware of that, because he keeps talking, about how he wants F-16s, he wants fighter jets, because they don't control the skies. And there's a lot of debate in the West about how much difference that would make. But then you have the political calculation. So what is next year? Next year is an election year in America. Now, it's the Americans who've given the Ukrainians, I mean, when you look at the graph, far, far, far more weaponry than any other country. I mean, Britain is second, but, the bar is much, much smaller for on the graph for what Britain has given. So it's the Americans. And yet, in America, support for Ukraine is not a vote winner. I mean, I think there's a general understanding, people aren't against the war in Ukraine, except for in some sections. But then you have Donald Trump. And Donald Trump saying, I could finish this war in a day. What does he mean by that?
I will prevent, and very easily, World War III, very easily. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. And it will take me no longer than one day.
What he means by that is putting his support behind President Putin and saying that the lines freeze where they are. And President Putin and Russia gets whatever much of Ukraine they've got at that particular time. You know, when the music stops, that's where the lines stay. So there is a huge pressure on Ukraine to push back as far as possible in case that happens.
But one thing that Europe has done particularly well has been training the Ukrainian soldiers, which seems like that would be quite important this spring, summer, because, you know, we'll come on to the Russians in a bit and how they're trained and all those failures. But it does seem that the Ukrainian army does have well-trained troops, brigades coming, which could be quite pivotal.
Yeah, look, what have the Russians got? The Russians have got what the military people call mass. They've got large numbers of soldiers, cannon fodder, you might call them. The Ukrainians don't have large numbers, not in the same way. You know, they don't have the same huge numbers. But their troops are much better trained and much more nimble. And this is why they've had the success they've had so far. And so you can remember, we saw this right from the beginning when the Russians were bearing down on Kyiv, and the Ukrainian units, who had already had, you know, quite a lot of training, but not the level of training they've had now. You know, you had units, you know, very small numbers, platoons with shoulder-launched anti-tank weapons, just basically nipping through the woods and going round the other side of tank formations and, you know, taking them out. And that's because they're able to maneuver and because they have a much more horizontal structure in their military, whereas the Russians have this very vertical structure. And so, yes, they are much more nimble and they're much better troops. But that doesn't make it easy, and it doesn't mean that they don't die. And it doesn't mean that you, as a soldier, who, you know, you believe in the cause and you're defending your country, but then 1, 2, 3, 4 of your comrades are killed. You know, it's very, very hard. It's extremely hard, and I don't think we should underestimate how hard that is and the sacrifice that, you know, that Ukrainians are making, and how that wears people down.
We touched on earlier about the Wagner Group. One thing you always talk about is also about the morale on both sides. You know, on the Ukrainian side, there is a sense that they have something to fight for, not necessarily on the Russian side. And there was a quote I was reading in the Times where they were talking about the difference between the Wagner Group and the Russian army, where they were saying, as soon as Wagner left and the regular Russian troops stepped in, they abandoned their positions. The Wagner fighters would hold positions until the very end. Many of them were prisoners, right? So they knew it was either fight or go back to prison. But the Russian soldiers have no motivation. They don't understand what they're doing here. Do you think that will play out as well, possibly?
Look, it's possible. So is Russia becoming Sudan? You know, that basically is outsourcing some of its fighting to these militia which are better trained. I don't think they're better equipped. But they can, you know, get equipment from different places and so on. So I thought that was, you know, that's something to watch, whether it is kind of fragmenting in that sense. But yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a mistake to think that all Russian forces aren't, you know, don't care and so on. Some of them are very patriotic, and some of them really believe, you know, what they've been told, which is that they're defending the motherland. But I think that it's when you get to the command structure that you have a problem, because there's this thing about not being able to make decisions on the ground as things happen, because everything gets referred up. And they have, I mean, interestingly, because I don't normally talk about this, they lost 2 commanders fairly recently in the last week or so, which I don't normally talk about. But they have, you know, quite a few of their generals have been killed. Now, part of that, and I think we've talked about this before, is because their comms are so bad. And sometimes the generals have to actually go down to the front line to find out what the hell is going on, which is not the way it should be. And that, I presume, again, will be a focus of the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, which is to try and mess up the Russian communications as much as possible. But so, you know, I think the Russians have a lot of disadvantages in the sense of how their army is structured and so on. But they have not lost.
You talk about the command structure and going up to the top. Do you get a sense of where Vladimir Putin is on this?
It's at the top.
But in the sense of how worried do you think he might be? I mean, everyone always talks about, will he press the nuclear button? I mean, he has no one within those circles criticizing him or threatening his position.
So we know a little bit about his inner circle, and we don't think that they criticize him. And we see the pictures on the television, and we analyze them, and we see how much everybody who's in a room with him across the table, like you and me, if you, let's say you're Putin and I'm the minister for economic whatever, and
we need
my
a
hands
longer
are
table.
shaking a little bit, and I'm blinking rather a lot, and I'm oh my God. And there was something he did with these poor school children where he was sort of quizzing them on history. I felt so sorry for them. I mean, it would be terrifying, wouldn't it? But then, of course, you've got Prigozhin. Now, Prigozhin criticizes all the time. I read something the other day which I thought was very good, which said about Prigozhin, it just said, Icarus, isn't it getting a little warm up there? And I thought that was very good. But I don't know whether Prigozhin is the court jester. He's the person who's allowed to bring the bad news to the king, or whether he's, he's going to be off with his head fairly soon.
And he often criticizes the Defense Department rather than Putin himself.
That's right. Yeah, he's quite careful about who he criticizes. But there's no indication as yet that Putin has had enough of Shoigu, who's the defense minister. I don't know. But I think that one of the other things which is very interesting, if you compare Zelenskyy with Putin, so we've seen Zelenskyy on this tour of Europe. I mean, Zelenskyy does his job very well. What is his job? His job is to be the public face of the war. His job is to go around shopping and to get the money, to get all the weaponry they need, and to be, to be the personification of Ukraine. His job is not to run the war. He has some pretty effective generals who are running the war, and from what we understand, he does not interfere too much. He needs to know what's going on. Of course he knows what's going on, but he's not directing it. Whereas Putin is said to be much more in command than that. He wants to be in control of everything. And of course, he's not a military man. And so, on strategy and so on, one wonders, I mean, his strategy for his own survival is very, very good. It's worked so far. On the broader battlefield, I don't know.
Ukraine's counteroffensive, whenever it may come, or even if it's begun, could possibly dictate the future front lines from which any peace talks begin. Negotiations are not currently on the cards, but there is talk of China potentially playing a role in the future. Li Hui, who was China's ambassador to Russia for a decade, is now Beijing's special envoy for the Ukraine war. He met with President Zelenskyy this week, the most senior Chinese official to visit the country since the war began, as part of a 5-country tour Beijing says is about starting dialogue toward a, quote, political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. But while China is keen to promote its emerging role as a global mediator, Ukraine's foreign minister said, following his meeting with Li Hui, that his country does not accept any proposals that would involve the loss of its territories or the freezing of the conflict. I mean, finally then, is the sense that come the end of this summer, whatever happens, the lines of the front line will be more in a position where we assume perhaps that both sides will then say, this is the time when there may be negotiations?
I don't think that both sides will say that, but I think that the allies of both sides may say that. So on the Russian side, the Chinese are increasingly concerned. And interestingly, you've got Chinese delegation going to see Zelenskyy and to go into Ukraine this week. And Zelenskyy has had a conversation with Xi Jinping. So initially, the Americans were very, very dismissive of the Chinese peace proposal, which was a sort of 12-point position statement. But the Americans have kind of backed off on that because they've begun to understand that actually maybe the Chinese can play a role. And the Chinese, having made peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, are very keen now to sort of, to play this role more on the international stage. And so there are all sorts of different arguments about whether it's beneficial or not beneficial for China for the war to go on. But we know that they don't want Russia to collapse, and they don't want Putin's regime to collapse. And so it's a question of what pressure they would be putting on the Russians. And then from the Ukrainian point of view, it's a question of what their allies, what pressure their allies are putting on. It's also a question of how much more armaments their allies can produce in the time required. Because, I mean, they are motoring through those ammunition shells. But then again, I come back to the American political season and whether the American view on this is going to to change. So I think a lot is going to be what pressure each side's allies put on them. And as for the Russians, it is down to one man. It is down to that one man into whose head we cannot see.
Lindsey Hilsum, always a pleasure. Thank you for talking to me.
Nice to talk to you, Kieran.